The Psychology Generation Gap. Why your mom still thinks therapy is just talking. Let me tell you about my dad, born in 1963. The man can break down complex physics and chemistry for ordinary people, but mention any application of psychological knowledge or tools to an individual, and he'll immediately think you're psychoanalyzing him. It's not his fault. People born in the 1960s grew up in a psychological dark age where mental health was basically, walk it off, and emotional intelligence was whatever you learned from watching John Wayne movies. To understand the generational gap, it's important to distinguish psychology from psychiatry. Psychology is the scientific study of mind and behavior, encompassing everything from learning and memory to emotion and social interaction. Psychiatry, meanwhile, is a branch of medicine focused on diagnosing, treating, and preventing mental disorders, often using medication and hospitalization. While the two fields overlap, especially in the treatment of mental health, psychology has historically emphasized talk therapy, behavioral interventions, and research, whereas psychiatry has leaned toward medical and biological models. The relationship between the two has been shaped by both collaboration and tension, especially during the 1960s and 1970s, when critics argued that psychiatry's medicalized approach sometimes overlooked the social and psychological roots of distress. The 1960s and 1970s saw a significant anti-psychiatry movement, with critics like Thomas Schash and R.D. Laing arguing that psychiatry was often repressive and could be more damaging than helpful to patients. This movement questioned the legitimacy of psychiatric diagnoses, the ethics of involuntary treatment, and the growing reliance on medication, while also pushing for more patient-centered and recovery-oriented care. In the U.S., the Community Mental Health Act of 1963 marked the beginning of deinstitutionalization, but mental health care remained stigmatized and underdeveloped. In France and much of Europe, mental health advocacy and public education were just beginning to take shape in the 1960s. So, while the 1960s babies were learning to walk, the entire field of accessible mental health was still in diapers. The manipulation recognition problem today. Psychology education teaches us about gaslighting, narcissistic abuse patterns, and emotional manipulation tactics. Gaslighting, for example, is now recognized as a form of psychological manipulation where someone tries to make another person doubt their own reality. Researchers have identified 6 primary manipulation tactics in relationships: charm, silent treatment, coercion, reason, regression, and debasement. But try explaining this to someone who grew up thinking psychology was just feelings talk. They literally don't have the vocabulary to recognize when someone is systematically undermining their reality. It's like being color-blind in a world where everyone else can see red flags. I watched my own mother endure years of what we'd now clearly identify as emotional abuse, but she had no framework to understand what was happening to her. She'd say things like, "He just has a strong personality," or, "He's very passionate about being right." No, Mom. He was gaslighting you into thinking your version of events was always wrong, but nobody taught you that term existed. The protective power of psychological literacy research shows that psychological education can function as a form of protection. Gaslighting is especially insidious in its early stages, when signs of emotional abuse are subtle and hard to identify. Victims of emotional abuse often develop what psychologists call reality monitoring deficits, a decreased confidence in their ability to distinguish between internal thoughts and external events. When you understand the mechanics of psychological manipulation, you can better protect yourself from developing these deficits. The generational divide in action. Compare this to younger generations, who grew up with psychological concepts normalized. Studies show that millennials and Gen Z are more likely to acknowledge mental health struggles and seek professional help than previous generations. They can spot a toxic relationship, identify boundary violations, and understand concepts like trauma bonding or love bombing. Meanwhile, the 1960s generation is still trying to figure out why their adult children keep using terms like emotional labor and boundaries. They often think setting boundaries is being selfish, not understanding that boundaries are actually a form of self-respect and relationship maintenance. The cruel irony? The generation that raised us to be tough and not take any crap from anyone inadvertently made themselves more vulnerable to psychological manipulation because they never learned the sophisticated tools for recognizing when someone is, in fact, giving them crap, just in a more subtle, systematic way. The missed opportunity. This isn't about blame. The 1960s generation didn't choose to miss out on psychological education. It simply wasn't available or was actively discouraged. The professionalization of psychiatry and psychology as sciences only gained momentum in the mid-20th century. They were living through the birth of modern psychology as a legitimate field. But think about what we've lost: an entire generation of parents, teachers, and leaders who lack the psychological tools to model healthy emotional regulation, recognize manipulation, or protect themselves and others from abuse. They're not equipped to spot the warning signs that younger generations learn to identify in Psychology 101. It's like they're trying to navigate modern relationships with a map from 1965, wondering why nothing looks familiar and why everyone else seems to know about roads that don't exist on their version. The good news? It's never too late to learn. But first, we need to acknowledge that this gap exists and stop acting like emotional intelligence is something people just naturally develop. For the 1960s generation, it's a foreign language, and like any foreign language, it requires intentional study, not just cultural osmosis. Maybe it's time for some remedial psychology education. After all, understanding manipulation tactics isn't just useful for therapy. It's essential for navigating a world full of people who definitely didn't miss that particular lesson. All sources and references are linked in the description below. Thank you for listening to this article. If you found it interesting, please consider subscribing to support my writing. Thank you.